Welcome to Liberty Today. Robert Brown is here with his scorecard of South Dakota and Montana congressional representatives when it comes to the Constitution. Bishop Kelly asks, was Job really all that patient? And for crying out loud, Napoli weeps over Obama. All this and more on today's Liberty Today.
Robert Brown, I have a question for you. As someone who studied the Constitution, and you are field director for JBS in eastern Montana, western South Dakota, what makes you think you're so smart that you could solve America's problems?
I love the question. And the answer is I don't. But I do feel like the Founding Fathers did have those kinds of solutions. Years ago, when I first began to study the Constitution, I learned two things. Number one, we're not following it anymore. And number two, if we were, it would solve the majority of our nation's problems. I just simply am advocating that it's time we recognize the wisdom of our Founding Fathers. I especially think of people like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, who especially did extensive research into the history of nations and nations' governments, what failed and why, and so on, so that we could learn the lessons of the past as we draw up a new form of government. They really drew on the lessons of history, which we're failing at today, in order to correct problems of previous civilizations.
Well, you know the question was tongue-in-cheek, but
certainly.
But let me ask you, is there someone, or are there some buddies in the United States Senate or Congress who might be a little, I'll say, Jeffersonian or follow the line and the thinking of our Founding Fathers? Are there some names that come to mind?
Well, there certainly are some names. I don't usually like to do too much as far as endorsing various politicians or candidates or whatever that way. But one of the things I always look to is our Freedom Index does rate their voting records compared to the Constitution. And there are a few who've been getting fairly good scores from time to time, even getting 100%. The first one that comes to my mind is out of Utah, Mike Lee, who probably more than most gets up into that 90 to 100% range. Rand Paul as well is another one that comes to mind.
And one that's not there anymore, Senator Jim DeMint was probably high on that
Fairly
index,
high.
wasn't he?
He wasn't a 100%er. He was certainly better than average.
So Rand Paul, Mike Lee, are there some others?
There are, and I don't really spend a lot of my time focusing on who they are so much as fixing the ones that aren't.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we don't have any of those from South Dakota or Montana in the areas where I am working.
Oh, wait a minute now. What did I just hear? Are you saying that the Freedom Index, which basically compares votes in the Senate and the House to constitutional principles in Montana and South Dakota, bastions of conservative politics, that we don't have representation that rates high on that index?
Unfortunately, that's precisely right. And what that says to me is that we have a lot of work to do.
Boy,
we have
I
a
would
lot of
say-
work to do to
I
get
would
them
say.
back to that. And what it really comes down to, in areas we've done this effectively around the country, getting this type of information into the hands of the citizens. I've seen that we just recently switched our congressman in Montana, but with the previous one, his voting record went from around a 50 or 60%er to around an 80 to 90%er. Just by constantly, at every turn, he'd hear from our people all over the state. I wanted to ask you about your vote on this particular issue that I find in the Freedom Index here, and where you felt you had the authority in the Constitution for that vote.
Let me ask you a question that might be helpful to our viewers, because we've made a serious indictment against the elected representatives in South Dakota and Montana. Where can people go for themselves to access the Freedom Index and look at their own representatives across the country and
Excellent
find
question.
out?
Just go to our website, which is jbs.org, and there you'll see a link at the top that says Voter Index. You click on that, you can look up any congressman, any senator's entire history of voting the entire time they've been in the
But
Congress.
you guys are just a bunch of radical lunatics.
Well, yes, it's pretty radical to hold them to that standard of the Constitution in today's political environment. But the thing I love about the Freedom Index is it always backs up what it's saying. It doesn't just say, we gave them a good score for voting for this one because we liked it. It says, we gave them a good score for voting in favor of this bill because the Constitution says such and such.
Imagine that a vote and the accountability for that vote should be looked at side by side with the appropriate constitutional authority.
Precisely.
My goodness. If you haven't been...
Pretty radical.
Pretty radical indeed in this environment. When we have a president who says he has a pen and a phone and so he'll just bypass Congress. Unfortunately, that's the same kind of arrogance we see in state administrations across the nation. And isn't it time, as taxpayers and voting citizens, that we hold our representatives accountable to the document that made our country great?
Absolutely.
And what would that document be?
Well, the U.S. Constitution really is
Yes.
the greatest liberty document ever written. If we were to return to its limits of power, I'd venture to guess that it would correct our imbalanced budget almost overnight. It'd solve our war problems, our economic problems, it'd solve our healthcare problems, and on and on and on.
Well, just before we conclude, give our viewers one more shot at the website where they can compare the voting records of their senators and representatives to the Constitution.
Okay, again, that's jbs.org, and there you look for the link at the top that says Voter Index, or excuse me, Voting Index.